There is a kind of pain that does not announce itself right away. It does not slam the door on the first day. It does not always begin with cruelty, rage, or obvious abuse. Sometimes it begins with beauty, with charm, with elegance, with a woman who seems unforgettable the moment she enters a room. She is magnetic without trying too hard. She knows how to smile at exactly the right moment. She makes people feel chosen, noticed, even special. And for a while, being near her feels like stepping closer to light. But then something shifts. Maybe it is so subtle you almost miss it. A comment that leaves a sting behind your ribs. A look that makes you question whether you imagined the warmth she gave you yesterday. A strange tension when someone else gets attention. A sweetness that suddenly turns cold the moment you stop reflecting back the admiration she wants. And now you are confused, because the same person who once made you feel seen is slowly making you feel small. The same voice that once sounded warm now carries an edge sharp enough to cut your confidence in half. The same presence that seemed so powerful and inspiring now feels strangely exhausting, as if every conversation bends back toward her needs, her image, her emotions, her control. That is what makes this subject so unsettling. Because when most people hear the word narcissism, they imagine a man. They picture loud arrogance, visible domination, a personality so inflated it is impossible to ignore. But what happens when narcissistic traits show up in a woman? What happens when they are wrapped in grace, beauty, emotional intelligence, social finesse, or even apparent vulnerability? What happens when the danger does not look dangerous at all? That is where many people get trapped. They do not recognize the pattern because it does not arrive wearing a villain's face. It may arrive wearing perfect makeup, a soft voice, a heartbreaking story, a brilliant smile, and the ability to make everyone in the room believe she is the most impressive person they have ever met. She may look deeply confident, but behind that image there can be something far more fragile and far more destructive, a desperate hunger to be admired, validated, prioritized, and protected from the unbearable feeling of being ordinary. And if you have ever found yourself asking questions like, "Why do I feel drained after being around her?" Or, "Why does everything always become about her?" Or, "Why do I feel like I'm never enough, no matter how much I give?" then this conversation may hit closer to home than you expect. Because sometimes the deepest emotional damage does not come from obvious enemies. Sometimes it comes from people who know exactly how to make you trust them before they begin to shape your reality. Sometimes it comes from someone who looks polished on the outside but leaves chaos inside the people closest to her. And sometimes the hardest truth to face is this: the person you admired may have been feeding on your admiration all along. If that already has your attention, take 1 second right now to subscribe to the channel and support the work we're doing here. Every subscription helps this channel keep creating honest, thoughtful videos that go deeper into the patterns most people feel but cannot always explain. If you want more content that helps you protect your peace, understand difficult relationships, and see through confusing emotional dynamics, subscribe now and stay with me all the way to the end. Now let's slow down for a moment, because this topic deserves maturity, nuance, and compassion. This is not about attacking women. This is not about calling every confident, attractive, ambitious, or emotionally expressive woman a narcissist. Healthy confidence exists. Strong women exist. Glamorous women exist. Charismatic women exist. Many women are radiant, powerful, loving, and emotionally grounded. There is nothing wrong with taking pride in your appearance, enjoying attention, being persuasive, being successful, or wanting a beautiful life. The issue is not femininity. The issue is not beauty. The issue is not confidence. The issue is pattern. It is the repeated pattern where empathy goes missing. Where love begins to feel conditional. Where admiration is expected but rarely returned. Where closeness becomes a transaction. Where another person's feelings matter only as long as they serve her emotional needs. Where image starts to matter more than truth. Where affection can turn into manipulation so quietly that the people involved do not fully understand what is happening until they are already deeply hurt. And that is why female narcissistic traits can be so difficult to identify. A narcissistic woman may not always dominate the room in the obvious way people expect. She may dominate it emotionally, socially, relationally. She may not scream to get control. She may charm her way into control. She may not look aggressive at first glance. She may look refined, wounded, misunderstood, even inspiring. But underneath that surface, there can be a relentless need to stay on top, stay admired, stay desired, stay superior, and never, ever be exposed as flawed, insecure, or less important than someone else. That pressure creates a very specific kind of emotional gravity. People around her begin adjusting themselves without even realizing it. They become more careful, more apologetic, more eager to please, more hesitant to outshine her. They learn to read the room, read her moods, read the danger of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. And over time, they start shrinking to keep the peace. That is not love. That is adaptation. And one of the most painful parts of this dynamic is that it often leaves people doubting their own instincts. Because she is not terrible all the time. That would make it easier. Instead, she may be warm, dazzling, generous, and supportive in moments that make you question your own pain. You remember the way she made you feel in the beginning. You remember the softness, the attention, the intensity, the way she seemed to understand you. So when the criticism comes, the jealousy comes, the coldness comes, the subtle humiliation comes, you do not immediately call it manipulation. You call it stress. Miscommunication. A rough patch. A misunderstanding. You give her the benefit of the doubt, again and again, while your self-worth quietly bleeds out in the background. That is why awareness matters. Not so you can label people carelessly. Not so you can diagnose your ex, your mother, your sister, your friend, your boss, or yourself after watching one video. Real diagnosis belongs to trained mental health professionals, and narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, is a serious clinical matter. This video is not a shortcut to diagnosis. It is a lens. A tool for reflection. A way to put language around patterns that many people feel but cannot fully name. Because once you can name a pattern, something powerful begins to happen. The fog starts to lift. The guilt starts to loosen. The confusion begins to make sense. You stop assuming every relational wound is your fault. You stop chasing approval from someone who only feels powerful when you feel uncertain. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. And slowly, maybe for the first time in a long time, you start trusting your own emotional reality again. In this video, we are going to walk through 7 of the most common female narcissistic traits and examine how they often show up in real life. We are going to look at how these patterns can affect attraction, image, money, loyalty, parenting, emotional power, and everyday relationships. Some of what you hear may surprise you. Some of it may feel uncomfortably familiar. And some of it may explain things you have carried in silence for years. So stay with me. Because the traits themselves are only part of the story. The bigger story is what these patterns do to the people around them. The confidence they erode. The anxiety they create. The love they distort. The homes they shape. The quiet wounds they leave behind in people who spent far too long trying to earn warmth that was never freely given. And once you see these patterns clearly, you may never look at certain relationships the same way again. Before we move on, here's a quick question for you. Do you think female narcissistic traits are usually easier to spot right away, or harder to recognize because they can hide behind charm and polish? A. Easier to spot right away. B. Harder to recognize because they often look charming at first. Comment A or B below. I want to see your answer in the comments. Part 1. Appearance as power. There are women who get dressed because they enjoy beauty, and then there are women who dress as if they are preparing for battle. From the outside, the difference can be almost impossible to see. Both may look polished. Both may look elegant. Both may know exactly how to carry themselves. But in one case, appearance is a form of self-expression. In the other, it becomes a form of power. That is where this trait begins. For a female narcissist, appearance is rarely just about style. It is not simply about fashion, good taste, or taking pride in her image. It becomes something much deeper than that. It becomes a language she uses to control how people feel around her. It becomes a shield against insecurity, a stage for admiration, and a weapon she can quietly turn on anyone who threatens her spotlight. In Chicago, Claire understood that language better than most people understood their own emotions. She knew how to enter a room before she physically entered it. Sometimes it was the sound of her heels. Sometimes it was the turn of a few heads before she even said a word. Sometimes it was the way she wore silence, as if everyone else needed to fill it with compliments. She had mastered the art of being noticed without appearing to ask for attention. That was part of what made her so compelling. Nothing about her seemed random. Her hair, her posture, the perfect balance between effort and effortless, the subtle luxury in what she wore, the way she seemed to glow under city lights at rooftop dinners and gallery events, it all communicated the same message without her having to say it out loud. She expected to be seen. And most of the time, she was. Daniel noticed that early. At first, he admired it. He told himself that Claire was simply confident, simply sophisticated, simply a woman who knew how to present herself well. In many ways, that is what he wanted to believe, because confidence is attractive. Poise is attractive. A strong sense of self is attractive. And Claire seemed to possess all of it. When she walked beside him through downtown Chicago, he could feel the way people looked at her. She had presence. She had polish. She had the kind of image that made ordinary moments feel cinematic. But over time, Daniel began to realize that Claire did not just enjoy attention. She depended on it in a way that changed the emotional climate around her. The more he watched, the more he saw that appearance was not just something she cared about. It was the ground she stood on. It was how she measured value. It was how she protected herself from feeling small. And because of that, any interruption in admiration felt much bigger to her than it seemed on the surface. One evening, they attended an event overlooking the Chicago River. The room was full of the kind of people Claire liked to be around, well-dressed, socially fluent, ambitious, impossible to impress unless you understood the rules. Claire arrived in a tailored cream dress that made her look as if she had stepped out of a magazine spread. For the first half hour, everything unfolded exactly the way she wanted. Compliments came easily. Conversations bent toward her. Women noticed her. Men noticed her. Daniel could see the subtle shift in her energy as the room reflected back what she needed to feel secure. Then another woman arrived. She was not louder than Claire. She was not more glamorous. She did not even seem to be trying. But she carried something Claire could not control: ease. The kind of ease that comes from not needing to compete. Within minutes, several people turned toward her with genuine curiosity, and Daniel saw Claire's expression change so quickly it almost vanished before he could fully register it. It was just a flicker. A tightening around the mouth. A small coolness in the eyes. A smile that looked the same from across the room but felt different if you were standing close enough to sense the temperature drop. That was the moment Daniel began to understand something important. Claire did not merely want to feel beautiful. She needed to feel superior. That is the hidden emotional engine behind appearance as power. For a woman with strong narcissistic traits, beauty is not only about admiration. It is about hierarchy. She is not asking, "Do I feel good in myself?" She is asking, "Am I above the other women in this room?" And once that becomes the real question, appearance stops being playful, creative, or joyful. It becomes a ranking system. It becomes a silent competition where another woman's glow can feel like a personal attack. That is why envy plays such a powerful role here. It is not always obvious envy. Sometimes it comes disguised as critique. A casual remark about someone looking a little desperate. A cutting joke about another woman's makeup, weight, age, or outfit. A smile followed by a subtle humiliation. It is often delivered with enough elegance that bystanders miss the aggression entirely. But the target feels it. The target always feels it. Claire was especially skilled at that kind of damage. She rarely exploded. She did not need to. A raised eyebrow, a faint laugh, a perfectly timed comment, and the room would shift. If another woman received too much praise, Claire could dismantle her in less than a minute without ever appearing openly cruel. That was part of her power. She understood that the most effective social aggression often arrives dressed as wit. And beneath all of it was a fear she would never admit. Because for someone like Claire, appearance is not just about being admired. It is also about never being exposed. If she is the most polished, the most desirable, the most composed, then maybe no one will see the insecurity underneath. Maybe no one will notice how fragile the structure really is. Maybe no one will look closely enough to see that the confidence is conditional, that it rises and falls depending on who is in the room, who is watching, and who might be stealing the emotional oxygen she believes belongs to her. That is why women with this trait often invest so intensely in maintenance. The skin care, the clothes, the procedures, the details, the performance of perfection, none of it is necessarily about pleasure alone. Often, it is about emotional survival. Every polished detail becomes part of a self that must never crack. Every compliment becomes proof that the image is still working. Every admiring glance becomes reassurance that she still holds power. And in the age of social media, this trait becomes even more seductive and even more dangerous. A woman like Claire does not just curate her closet. She curates reality. The right lighting, the right restaurant, the right angle, the right caption, the right impression. What people see is beauty, ease, status, and certainty. What they do not see is how much emotional force is tied to sustaining that image. They do not see how quickly admiration can become panic when it disappears. They do not see how another woman's success, beauty, or natural confidence can trigger an internal collapse that then gets redirected outward as judgment, pettiness, exclusion, or shame. This is what makes appearance such a powerful trait in female narcissism. It is not shallow in the ordinary sense. It is psychologically loaded. It is emotional territory. It is identity management. It is self-worth outsourced to mirrors, reactions, and comparisons. And the cost is never paid by her alone. The people around her begin to feel it too. Friends become cautious. Partners become confused. Other women feel subtly evaluated, as if every interaction contains an invisible test they did not agree to take. Daniel felt that pressure growing every time he went somewhere with Claire. He started noticing that he was not simply accompanying her. He was helping maintain a world in which she had to remain untouchable. If he complimented another woman too warmly, he would feel Claire withdraw. If he failed to notice some detail about her appearance, he would sense the offense, even if she never named it directly. If the room did not respond to her the way she expected, the evening somehow became heavier for everyone. That is the tragedy of this trait. What looks glamorous from the outside can become exhausting up close. Because true beauty invites connection. It creates warmth. It allows other people to exist fully beside it. But narcissistic beauty demands emotional tribute. It needs witnesses. It needs reassurance. It needs comparison. And if that validation is interrupted, someone usually pays the price. So when we talk about appearance as power, we are not talking about a woman who simply loves fashion or takes pride in how she looks. We are talking about a woman who has fused her image with her worth so completely that being admired feels necessary, and being overshadowed feels unbearable. We are talking about beauty that no longer serves self-expression, but domination. We are talking about a polished exterior that can hide a very unstable emotional core. And once you see that clearly, you begin to understand that the mirror is never just a mirror for her. It is a battlefield. Part 2: Seduction with a Purpose. There is a kind of seduction that does not begin with touch. It begins with attention so precise it feels almost sacred. A woman like Claire does not need to rush. She does not need to be obvious. In many ways, that is what makes her so hard to read. She understands that the most powerful form of attraction is not always beauty alone, and it is not even desire alone. It is the feeling she can create inside another person that he has finally been recognized in a way no one else has ever managed to do. That is how Daniel first fell deeper in than he ever intended. It was not just that Claire was beautiful. Chicago is full of beautiful women, polished women, charismatic women, women who know exactly how to move through a room. Claire's effect was different. She seemed to study people without making it look like she was studying them. She listened with a kind of focus that made you feel as if the rest of the world had briefly gone silent. When Daniel spoke, Claire had a way of holding eye contact just a second longer than most people would. Not enough to appear theatrical, but enough to make the moment feel intimate. She asked questions that seemed thoughtful, but what made them so effective was not the questions themselves. It was the impression they created, that she was deeply interested, deeply present, deeply drawn toward the very center of who he was. For Daniel, that was intoxicating. He had known charming people before. He had known flirtation, chemistry, the ordinary dance of attraction. What he felt with Claire seemed richer than that. She made him feel chosen. Not casually noticed, not vaguely admired, but chosen with intent. And for most people, that feeling reaches into something vulnerable. Everyone wants to believe they are special to someone. Everyone wants to believe there is a version of themselves that another person can see with unusual clarity. Claire understood that hunger better than Daniel understood it in himself. That is one of the deepest truths about seduction in female narcissism. it is often less about physical pursuit and more about emotional targeting. A woman with these traits may not seduce everyone around her. In fact, she often becomes more convincing because she does not. She can be selective, deliberate, restrained. Her energy narrows toward the person she wants, and that selectiveness creates the illusion of sincerity. Daniel interpreted it as depth. What he did not yet understand was that Claire was not simply moving toward what she felt. She was moving toward what she valued. And value, to someone like Claire, has layers. Daniel was successful enough to be useful. Grounded enough to feel safe. Admiring enough to be nourishing. Socially established enough to raise her sense of status. Emotionally open enough to be shaped. He had all the qualities that made him attractive, but also all the qualities that made him vulnerable to a certain kind of carefully designed attachment. Claire did not need to say any of this out loud. Seduction of this kind is rarely verbalized in its true form. It operates through atmosphere, pacing, mirroring, and emotional suggestion. She mirrored him beautifully. If Daniel spoke about architecture, Claire suddenly seemed fascinated by design. If he spoke about family, she softened in exactly the right way, as if she too carried old tenderness and old wounds. If he shared an ambition, she reflected it back with admiration that felt rare and encouraging. If he revealed a fear, she handled it gently enough that he felt safe offering more. It all felt natural in the moment. That is how these dynamics work. Nothing about it seems false when you are inside it. In fact, it feels more real than most connections precisely because it is crafted to fit you. This is where seduction becomes more than attraction. It becomes adaptation in service of influence. Claire could make herself feel like the answer to a question Daniel had not fully known he was asking. She could become elegant if he admired sophistication, vulnerable if he felt protective, witty if he valued intelligence, emotionally complex if he craved depth. It was not that every gesture was fake in a cold, mechanical sense. The danger is subtler than that. People like Claire can genuinely enjoy the feeling of pursuit, genuinely enjoy the energy of being desired, genuinely enjoy the thrill of emotional fusion. But what they often enjoy most is what that bond gives them: access, affirmation, leverage, and the intoxicating relief of being central in someone else's emotional world. That is why the beginning can feel so powerful. Daniel found himself opening up to Claire faster than he normally would. With her, ordinary evenings felt charged. A drink downtown no longer felt like a drink, it felt like the start of a story. A walk through the city no longer felt casual, it felt cinematic, almost faded. She knew how to create emotional acceleration. She knew how to make intensity feel like destiny. And when a person is drawn into that kind of atmosphere, discernment often gives way to longing. He did not ask himself why everything felt so fast. He only knew that being desired by Claire felt like entering a brighter version of himself. But purposeful seduction always carries a hidden transaction. The version of Claire that Daniel fell for was not merely spontaneous intimacy. It was a relationship strategy. She was learning what fed him, yes, but she was also learning what would bind him. Which compliments mattered most? Which insecurities made him work harder for reassurance? Which kind of distance made him lean in? Which type of softness disarmed him fastest? Seduction in this form is not just about getting close. It is about discovering the emotional architecture of another person so that closeness can later be managed, withheld, intensified, or weaponized. And this is where many people become confused, because at first the seduction feels generous. Claire seemed available. Curious. Emotionally brave. She shared stories that hinted at old disappointments, old betrayals, old moments when people had failed to understand her. Daniel heard those confessions and felt trusted. What he did not realize was that selective vulnerability can be one of the most effective tools in targeted seduction. Shared pain creates intimacy quickly. It awakens tenderness. It invites rescue. It allows the other person to step into a meaningful role before they fully understand the larger pattern unfolding around them. Daniel wanted to be different from the people who had hurt her. Claire made that desire easy to feel. That is part of what gives this trait its emotional depth and its emotional danger. The seduction does not only flatter desire. It recruits empathy. It makes the other person want to protect, prove, provide, and stay. He is no longer simply attracted. He is invested. He now feels connected to the idea of who she is, to the ache beneath her beauty, to the promise that if he loves her well enough, steadily enough, deeply enough, something profound will unfold between them. But for someone like Claire, seduction is often strongest before true mutuality begins. Once she felt Daniel was securely attached, small changes emerged. Not all at once. That would have broken the spell too soon. Instead, the warmth became slightly less reliable. The responses became less immediate. The admiration that once flowed so naturally now appeared in smaller doses, making Daniel notice its absence with surprising intensity. When she gave it again, it felt even more valuable. This is how emotional dependence quietly forms. What was once abundant becomes intermittent, and intermittent affection often creates a stronger hold than constant affection ever could. Now Daniel was not simply enjoying Claire. He was seeking her. Reading her moods. Replaying conversations. Wondering whether he had done something wrong. Wanting to get back to the earlier version of her, the version that had made him feel so vividly seen. And that is the hidden cruelty of purposeful seduction. It awakens deep emotional hope before revealing that the connection was never as balanced as it seemed. The closeness was real in effect, but not equal in structure. Daniel was being drawn into a bond. Claire was establishing position within it. To someone on the outside, her behavior might still have looked romantic, even enviable. She knew how to perform the gestures people associate with passion. The private smile, the late-night message, the softness in her voice, the feeling that she and Daniel shared a world no one else could fully understand. But beneath that surface, her orientation remained the same. She needed to be desired, prioritized, emotionally secured. And Daniel, without realizing it, had become a source of that supply. That is why this kind of seduction is so difficult to recover from. The person caught in it does not only lose a relationship. He loses a story he believed in. He loses the version of connection that felt meaningful, rare, almost sacred. And because Claire's early attention had reached him so deeply, its withdrawal did not feel like ordinary disappointment. It felt like starvation. So when we talk about seduction with a purpose, we are not talking about harmless flirtation or natural chemistry. We are talking about the strategic use of beauty, attention, vulnerability, and emotional intuition to draw someone into a bond that centers power more than reciprocity. We are talking about closeness that feels intimate but is often built around acquisition. We are talking about attraction that does not simply say, "Come closer." It says, "Come closer so I can become essential to you." And once a woman like Claire achieves that, the relationship is no longer driven by the thrill of being discovered. It is driven by the need to maintain control over what she has captured. Part 3: Confidence built on comparison. There is a kind of confidence that feels warm when you stand near it. It has room for other people. It does not need to prove itself every 5 minutes. It can admire someone else without shrinking. It can lose without collapsing. It can be corrected without turning cruel. That kind of confidence is grounded. It comes from inner stability. Then there is another kind. It looks dazzling at first. It is polished, composed, and often very persuasive. It can walk into a room and make insecurity look like certainty. But if you stay close long enough, you begin to notice something unsettling. It only seems to rise when someone else is being lowered. It does not draw strength from self-knowledge. It draws strength from comparison. It does not ask, "Do I know who I am?" It asks, "Am I above you?" That is the kind of confidence Claire carried. To most people in Chicago, Claire seemed unshakable. She spoke with the kind of calm authority that made people listen before they even decided whether they agreed with her. She had social ease, strong opinions, beautiful posture, and the kind of presence that can make hesitation in other people look like weakness. On the surface, nothing about her suggested self-doubt. She looked like a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. Daniel wanted to believe that was true. In the beginning, he even admired it. He thought her decisiveness meant maturity. He thought her sharp observations meant intelligence. He thought her refusal to be ordinary meant she had standards. And in some moments, she really did seem deeply self-possessed. She knew what she liked. She knew how she wanted to be treated. She knew how to hold a room. To someone who had spent much of his own life being measured, responsible, and careful, Claire's certainty felt magnetic. But over time, Daniel began to notice that Claire's confidence had a strange fragility to it. It was strongest when she was being admired. It was strongest when she was the standard other people were measured against. It was strongest when someone else in the room looked uncertain, awkward, less stylish, less accomplished, or less compelling. In those moments, Claire seemed to expand. Her humor sharpened. Her posture loosened. Her voice gained warmth again. It was as if someone else's diminished light gave her permission to glow. That is what comparison-based confidence does. It creates an emotional ladder and then quietly demands that someone always remain lower on it. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel saw it more clearly than ever. They were at a late brunch in Chicago with a small group of people from overlapping professional circles. The conversation moved easily at first. Then someone mentioned a woman who had recently launched a successful nonprofit initiative and was getting attention across the city. The praise around the table was genuine. People admired her work, her discipline, her vision. Daniel noticed Claire smiling as she listened, but it was the kind of smile he had begun to mistrust. It looked appropriate from a distance, but up close it carried no warmth. When the woman's name came up again, Claire leaned back and said, in a voice smooth enough to pass as casual, "She's definitely good at getting attention." Though sometimes people confuse visibility with substance. The table went quiet for half a second. Not long enough for anyone to challenge her, but long enough for the energy to shift. It was subtle. Elegant, even. That was Claire's gift. She rarely needed to attack directly. A well-placed sentence was enough. She could reduce the force of someone else's success without looking bitter. She could introduce doubt into a compliment and then sit back while the room adjusted. Daniel felt it immediately, not because he was shocked, but because he had seen versions of it before. A congratulation with a sting hidden inside it. A compliment that somehow managed to diminish the person receiving it. A concern that sounded thoughtful but carried the quiet pleasure of discrediting someone. Claire was too socially intelligent to be openly petty. Her comparisons came dressed in sophistication. That is one of the reasons this trait can be so difficult to recognize. Many people assume confidence means volume. They assume arrogance must be obvious. But comparison-based confidence is often refined. It can sound intelligent. It can sound discerning. It can sound like high standards, realism, or honesty. And yet, if you listen closely, the pattern remains the same. Someone else rises, and Claire instinctively reaches for a way to lower the emotional height of that moment. Why? Because someone else's brightness does not merely exist alongside her. It threatens the story she tells herself about her place in the world. That is the hidden wound beneath this trait. A woman like Claire does not compare because she is simply mean. She compares because she cannot fully rest inside herself. Another woman's beauty, success, calm, or authenticity can feel like evidence of her own insufficiency. The pain of that feeling is often immediate and intolerable. So instead of processing it inwardly, she manages it outwardly. She critiques. She dismisses. She reinterprets. She finds the flaw. She finds the angle. She creates a subtle emotional correction that restores the hierarchy she needs in order to feel safe again. That is why she may struggle with genuine admiration. To admire someone sincerely, you have to allow that person's value to exist without it reducing your own. You have to believe worth is not scarce. You have to believe another person's beauty does not erase yours, another person's talent does not humiliate yours, another person's confidence does not expose your weakness. But Claire did not seem to live in that emotional reality. She lived in a world where worth was measured comparatively, where every room contained invisible rankings, and where security depended on staying above the line. For Daniel, this became more painful the closer he got to her. At first, he thought her comments about other people were just part of her sharp personality. Then he realized the pattern was broader than that. Claire did not only compare herself to women she considered rivals. She compared herself to nearly everyone. Friends, colleagues, strangers, even people she claimed not to care about. She noticed who was admired, who was ignored, who was aging well, who was slipping, who had influence, who had lost it, who had the better relationship, the better body, the better network, the better life. Her awareness was constant. Her inner radar never seemed to power down. And because she was always measuring, she was never at peace. That is one of the tragic ironies of narcissistic confidence. From the outside, it can look superior. From the inside, it is often restless. It cannot settle because comparison never ends. There is always someone younger, someone richer, someone more effortless, someone more genuinely loved, someone less dependent on performance. So the person who builds confidence this way lives in a state of endless scanning, endlessly checking whether she is still winning. And when her sense of worth depends on winning, ordinary human moments become dangerous. Someone else receives praise. Someone else is chosen. Someone else is trusted. Someone else enters the room and does nothing but exist fully in herself. That alone can feel unbearable. Daniel began to notice how much this affected the emotional atmosphere around Claire. People who spent enough time with her became careful. Women around her often seemed to shrink slightly, as if they could feel they were being evaluated. Men sometimes confused her confidence for strength and only later realized how much of it was fueled by quiet contempt. Even Daniel found himself filtering what he said. If he admired another woman's work too openly, Claire might turn cool. If he disagreed with her in front of others, her face would not always change, but the punishment would come later in smaller ways. A silence. A withdrawal. A cutting remark disguised as insight. He began to understand that her confidence was not simply something she possessed. It was something everyone around her was expected to protect. That kind of emotional structure wears people down. It also distorts relationships, because real intimacy cannot thrive where one person constantly needs the upper hand. Love requires room for equality. Friendship requires generosity. Respect requires the ability to tolerate another person's strength without making it personal. But when confidence is built on comparison, closeness becomes difficult. Every relationship becomes vulnerable to hidden competition. Every interaction carries the possibility of hierarchy. Every success can be reinterpreted as a threat. The saddest part is that people like Claire often do not see the full cost of what they are doing. They may genuinely believe they are simply being honest, holding standards, or refusing to be intimidated. They may not recognize how often they puncture joy to protect ego. They may not understand that what they call confidence feels, to others, like emotional domination. They only know that for a brief moment, when someone else looks smaller, they feel larger. For a brief moment, when someone else is discredited, they feel secure. For a brief moment, the quiet fear underneath recedes. But only for a moment. Because confidence built on comparison can never fully satisfy. It is too dependent, too hungry, too externally driven. It needs constant material. Another person to outshine. Another flaw to locate. Another moment to reclaim. And beneath all that polished certainty lies a very painful truth: if your self-worth depends on standing above others, then you are never really standing on solid ground at all. That is what Daniel slowly came to see in Claire. What looked like confidence was often a system of emotional survival. Sharp, elegant, convincing, even impressive at times, but never truly free. It needed witnesses. It needed rankings. It needed someone else to come second. And that is not confidence. That is insecurity with excellent posture. Part 4: Money as Status, Image, and Control. Money is never just money in a dynamic like this. For someone like Claire, it becomes something far more emotionally charged than bills, budgets, or practical choices. It becomes proof. Proof that she matters, proof that she belongs above the ordinary, proof that the image she works so hard to protect is still intact. To the outside world, her relationship with money can look aspirational, even glamorous. But up close, Daniel began to understand that what Claire really chased was not comfort. It was status translated into objects, experiences, and the reactions those things could pull out of other people. Chicago gave her endless ways to play that game. The city suited her because it offered the perfect backdrop for a life performed at a high gloss. Rooftop dinners with skyline views. Boutique hotels where the lobby alone felt like a statement. Private events where everyone seemed to be competing without admitting it. Restaurants where the reservation itself said something. In places like that, Claire looked almost perfectly at home. She knew how to order, how to arrive, how to dress, how to create the impression that luxury followed her naturally. Daniel saw how easily people assumed she was solid, successful, established. She carried the aesthetics of security so well that few people stopped to ask what stood underneath them. At first, Daniel saw her spending as part of her taste. He told himself she appreciated beauty, quality, and detail. There was nothing wrong with that. Plenty of people work hard and enjoy spending their money on things that make life feel richer. But Claire's relationship to money felt different from simple enjoyment. She did not just want beautiful things. She needed the emotional atmosphere those things created around her. A designer bag was not only a bag. It was a message. A luxury weekend was not only a getaway. It was evidence. A reservation at the right place was not about the food so much as the feeling of being seen in the right setting, among the right people, living the kind of life that could not be mistaken for average. That is what made money so psychologically important to her. It gave visible form to the identity she needed others to believe in. Claire rarely spoke about money in crude terms. She was too socially refined for that. She would never say, "I need expensive things to feel important." Instead, it came through in subtler language. Standards. Quality. Energy. Class. She framed spending as discernment. She described luxury as natural, as if she were simply aligned with a better level of life than most people could understand. Daniel noticed how often she spoke about places, brands, neighborhoods, and experiences not for what they were, but for what they signaled. Even the smallest choices seemed tied to image. She could turn coffee into a class marker, travel into a social ranking, and home decor into a statement about who had evolved and who had not. The emotional weight behind all of this became clearer the first time Daniel suggested something simple. It was a Friday evening, and he mentioned a quiet neighborhood restaurant he liked, one of those warm, understated places that felt intimate without trying too hard. Claire's face changed almost imperceptibly. She did not reject the idea directly. She smiled, tilted her head, and said, "We can do that sometime. I just feel like tonight should be a little more special." The words themselves were harmless. But Daniel could hear what sat underneath them. Simple was not special. Unimpressive was not acceptable. Ordinary could not hold her. So they went somewhere else, somewhere louder, brighter, more visible. Claire came alive the moment they walked in. She straightened in a way Daniel had come to recognize. Not because she was relaxed, but because she was feeding on the environment. The place itself seemed to validate her. She liked rooms where status could be felt before it was spoken, where even the lighting seemed to flatter hierarchy. Daniel watched her that night as she moved through the space with effortless precision, as if she were not merely enjoying the evening but confirming herself through it. That is one of the most important things to understand about money in female narcissism. It is rarely only about possession. It is about emotional positioning. Claire did not simply want to have nice things. She wanted those things to place her above need, above limitation, above the humiliating possibility of being seen as less powerful than she wanted to appear. Money allowed her to curate distance between herself and vulnerability. If she looked expensive enough, perhaps no one would look closely at the anxiety beneath it. If her life appeared elevated enough, perhaps she would not have to feel the old shame she spent so much energy outrunning. If people envied her, admired her, or felt slightly smaller around her, then for a moment she could believe the performance had become reality. But of course, performance always has a cost. Daniel began to notice the contradictions. Claire could spend with astonishing confidence, but the confidence never extended to consequences. She had a gift for acting as if future problems would rearrange themselves around her image. Bills were treated like irritations rather than realities. Financial limits felt, to her, almost insulting. Budgeting was not simply boring. It seemed beneath the identity she was trying to inhabit. To plan too carefully, to restrain too much, to live within visible limits, all of that threatened the fantasy of exceptionality she needed to maintain. So she spent not from stability, but from entitlement. And entitlement with a credit line can be a dangerous combination. There were weekends Daniel knew she could not really afford. Purchases that seemed less like decisions and more like emotional reactions. Moments when a compliment from a stranger or a social event on the calendar would trigger a fresh round of spending, as if the upcoming occasion required an upgraded version of self. New shoes, new treatments, new accessories, new reservations, new proof. Daniel started to understand that Claire was not simply buying objects. She was buying temporary relief from an internal feeling she could never name directly. Each purchase soothed something for a moment. Each visible marker of status briefly restored the sense that she was winning, ascending, protected. But because the feeling came from outside, it never lasted. That is why these patterns can become so destructive in relationships. Money, for Claire, was not only self-soothing. It could also become relational pressure. Daniel felt this slowly, then all at once. At first it showed up as expectations wrapped in romance. Better gifts. Better plans. Better places. Then it sharpened into judgment. If he suggested something modest, it felt to her like a lack of imagination. If he hesitated around cost, she sometimes went quiet in a way that made him feel small, as though practicality were a sign of insufficiency. She did not always accuse him openly. Often she did not need to. Her disappointment was enough. It created a subtle emotional equation: love should look expensive, devotion should look elevated, and if he truly understood her, he would know that ordinary effort was never going to be enough. This is where money begins to function as control. A woman like Claire can use financial standards to keep a partner chasing approval. The point is not always the item itself. The point is the hierarchy it creates. If Daniel could provide the right experiences, the right gifts, the right visible devotion, then perhaps he could remain in good standing. But because the standard was emotional rather than practical, it was always moving. There was always a higher tier, a more impressive gesture, a more exclusive place, a more convincing display of his willingness to meet her where she believed she belonged. And perhaps the most painful part was this: Claire often seemed to believe her own story. She did not experience herself as manipulative in the obvious sense. She experienced herself as deserving. She had built such a complete emotional fusion between money and worth that to be denied the symbols of status felt, to her, like being denied recognition itself. She was not just disappointed by limits. She was wounded by them. They reminded her that she was not above reality, not above dependence, not above being measured by the same practical world everyone else had to live in. And that was intolerable. So she leaned harder into appearance, experience, and display. Daniel saw this most clearly online. Claire's social media presence was immaculate. Not fake exactly, but filtered through a very specific emotional logic. A candlelit table, a skyline behind glass, the corner of a designer label, a caption that implied effortless motion through a beautiful life. None of it screamed. That would have been too obvious. Instead, it whispered status. It invited comparison. It created aspiration. To strangers, it looked elegant. To Daniel, it began to look like an altar built to a self that could only survive if it kept being admired. That is the tragedy behind money as status and image. From the outside, it can look like success. From the inside, it is often fear in expensive clothing. Fear of being ordinary. Fear of being overlooked. Fear of being one woman among many instead of the woman everyone notices. Fear that without the symbols, the settings, and the visible proof of elevation, something unprotected and deeply uncertain would finally be exposed. So the spending continues. The image continues. The demand continues. And everyone near her is drawn into helping her maintain a world that grows more fragile the more polished it becomes. By the time Daniel fully grasped this, he no longer saw Claire's spending as taste alone. He saw it as emotional architecture. Every purchase held up part of the identity she could not bear to let collapse. Every display of status pushed back against some old, unnamed shame. Every expensive experience allowed her to feel, briefly, like the woman she was determined to be in the eyes of others. But money cannot heal shame. It can only decorate it. And when status becomes the language a person uses to ask the world for worth, no amount is ever quite enough. Part 5: Love, Fidelity, and the Hunger for Better. Love, in a relationship like this, rarely breaks all at once. It erodes. It thins out quietly, almost invisibly at first, until one day the person giving everything realizes he has been starving in plain sight. That was the part Daniel could never explain well to other people. If someone had asked him in the beginning whether Claire loved him, he would have said yes without hesitation. Not because she was consistently kind, and not because the relationship felt safe, but because the intensity was so convincing. There was a season when Claire made love feel cinematic. Her attention had weight. Her desire had heat. Her presence could make an ordinary night in Chicago feel charged with meaning, as if the city itself were standing slightly closer to them. Daniel did not just feel wanted. He felt selected, elevated, almost transformed by the way Claire looked at him when she wanted him near. That is why the unraveling hurt the way it did. The beginning had not felt casual. It had felt rare. But one of the cruelest truths about narcissistic love is that it often begins with idealization, not intimacy. The other person is not loved in the steady, human, grounded sense. He is lifted, framed, turned into something emotionally useful. For Claire, Daniel became a mirror that reflected back stability, devotion, admiration, and status. He was someone she could move toward when she wanted closeness, someone she could display when she wanted confirmation, someone whose love could temporarily quiet the emptiness she never named directly. And as long as he played that role well, the relationship felt alive. Then the need changed. That is what Daniel slowly came to understand. Claire did not simply want love. She wanted emotional supply. She wanted reassurance without interruption, attention without limits, loyalty without the burden of equal vulnerability. And because that kind of need is never truly satisfied, the relationship was always destined to shift. No matter how sincere Daniel was, no matter how much he cared, he could not permanently fill a hunger that was tied to Claire's unstable sense of self. At first, the changes were subtle enough to deny. The warmth that once came so naturally now arrived in smaller doses. The praise became less generous. Claire still had moments of tenderness, but they no longer felt like the baseline of the relationship. They felt like rewards. Daniel began to notice that he was working harder for the same emotional closeness that once seemed effortless. He listened more carefully, apologized more quickly, adjusted more often. When Claire grew distant, he searched for reasons inside himself. Had he missed something? Failed to notice something? Said the wrong thing in the wrong tone? He kept assuming there must be a fix, because it was easier to believe he was making mistakes than to face the deeper possibility that the structure of the relationship itself was built on instability. That is how many people get trapped. They confuse unpredictability with complexity. They confuse emotional withdrawal with depth. They confuse the effort to win someone back with proof of love. Claire understood, perhaps not always consciously but instinctively, how powerful inconsistency could be. When she was affectionate again after a period of coldness, Daniel felt relief so strong it almost looked like joy. That relief bonded him more tightly than constant kindness ever could have. It made him grateful for moments that should have been ordinary. It made him overvalue scraps of warmth because he was now measuring them against absence. Slowly, without intending to, he had begun organizing his emotional life around Claire's fluctuations. And once that happens, fidelity becomes more than a question of cheating. It becomes a question of where the narcissistic person's attention goes when admiration, novelty, or advantage appears elsewhere. Claire was never content in the simple sense. Contentment requires the ability to rest. It requires the capacity to remain with what is good without constantly scanning for something better, brighter, more validating. But Claire's inner world did not seem built for rest. Even in moments when Daniel gave her love, stability, generosity, and patience, there was still a strange movement inside her, a subtle turning outward as if some part of her was always listening for another door to open. That is the hunger for better. It does not always begin with betrayal in the dramatic sense. Sometimes it begins with comparison. A new man enters the social orbit. Someone with more status, more influence, more money, more novelty, more ability to make Claire feel elevated again. Daniel began noticing how her energy could change around certain people. She became brighter, sharper, more alive in a way that did not always have an obvious name. She might not cross a line anyone else could point to, but Daniel could feel the shift because he had lived close enough to her emotional weather to recognize when the air changed. This is why relationships with narcissistic partners can feel so destabilizing. The threat is not always what is happening openly. It is what is happening psychologically. The partner begins to sense that love is no longer a bond, but a competition he did not know he was entered into. He feels he is being measured against invisible alternatives. He feels there are standards no one fully explains, and the punishment for not meeting them is distance, contempt, or replacement. Daniel felt that fear growing long before he had proof of anything. It lived in small moments. Claire checking her phone with a private softness in her face she no longer brought to him. The sudden mention of another man's success delivered too casually. The way she seemed invigorated by outside attention in a way that made Daniel feel less like a partner and more like an option she already knew she had secured. It was not one moment that broke trust. It was the accumulation of tiny dislocations. Each one small enough to dismiss on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that hollowed him out. And perhaps the deepest wound was not the possibility that Claire might leave. It was the growing realization that even when she stayed, she was never fully with him in the way he had believed. Some part of her remained turned toward the next source of energy, the next person who could restore the feeling of excitement, superiority, or emotional leverage. Daniel had entered the relationship hoping to build closeness. Claire had entered it needing regulation. Once his devotion became familiar rather than thrilling, it lost some of its power to sustain her. That is the tragedy of being loved by someone who experiences people as sources rather than equals. You can be adored, desired, and prioritized for a season, then slowly devalued not because you failed as a human being, but because your emotional usefulness no longer creates the same intensity it once did. Familiarity becomes disappointment. Stability becomes dullness. Loyalty becomes something she expects rather than something she cherishes. And because she cannot bear the emptiness inside herself, she begins to imagine the solution must exist somewhere outside the relationship. The grass starts glowing elsewhere. But what makes this dynamic so devastating is that Daniel did not immediately see it as Claire's problem. He saw it as his inadequacy. That is what narcissistic love does to people over time. It turns their attention inward in the worst way. They begin auditing themselves constantly. Maybe he was less exciting now. Maybe he should have planned more, earned more, wanted more, read her better, kept her happier. Maybe the early version of Claire could return if he just loved her with enough precision. He kept trying to earn back something that had never actually been secure. He was reaching for the beginning, not realizing the beginning itself had been part of the trap. Because idealization is powerful precisely because it creates emotional contrast. Once someone has felt that level of attention, they will work painfully hard to recover it. Claire did not need to say, "Compete for me." The structure of the relationship already communicated it. Daniel competed with her moods, with her disappointment, with her silence, with the memory of who she had once seemed to be, and eventually with the unseen possibility of someone else. That kind of competition exhausts the soul because there is no stable finish line. There is only temporary reprieve. And still, Daniel stayed longer than he should have, because hope can be one of the strongest chains in a relationship like this. Hope that she would soften. Hope that the stress would pass. Hope that the coldness was temporary. Hope that the version of Claire who once looked at him with such hunger and tenderness was still the truest version. But hope becomes dangerous when it keeps asking you to deny the pattern standing right in front of you. The deeper truth was simpler and harder. Claire did not know how to remain faithfully inside a bond that no longer intensified her sense of self. Whether through emotional triangulation, private fantasies of replacement, flirtation that crossed silent lines, or the restless pursuit of someone more useful, more exciting, or more elevating, she was always vulnerable to the pull of better. Not because Daniel was lacking, but because no single person can satisfy a need built on chronic emptiness. That is why fidelity in this dynamic is not just about physical exclusivity. It is about emotional steadiness, and Claire did not possess it. Her loyalty flowed toward whatever best protected her ego in the moment. If Daniel admired her, he mattered. If another person promised fresher validation, that person began to matter too. Love, then, became conditional not on trust, but on supply. By the time Daniel could name what had happened, the damage was already deep. He had spent so long trying to become enough for Claire that he had almost forgotten how to recognize enough within himself. That is what this kind of relationship takes from people first, not their logic, not even their peace, but their internal center. They stop living from self-trust and start living from emotional pursuit. And that is why the hunger for better is so destructive. It does not just threaten commitment. It turns love into a moving target, loyalty into anxiety, and intimacy into a performance no one can sustain forever. Part 6, Parenting Through Extension, Not Empathy. A child comes into the world with a silent hope that feels almost sacred. Before there are words, before there are achievements, before there is any understanding of status, image, or performance, a child is asking one simple emotional question with their whole being: am I safe with you? Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. Safe to be small. Safe to be messy. Safe to fail. Safe to need comfort without having to earn it. Safe to bring joy, fear, anger, confusion, and imperfection into the room without feeling that love might be withdrawn. That is what healthy parenting protects. But when a mother has strong narcissistic traits, something profound begins to distort that bond. She may still feed the child, dress the child, praise the child, post pictures of the child, advocate for the child, even sacrifice for the child in visible ways. From the outside, people may see devotion. What they do not always see is the emotional structure underneath. They do not see that the child is not always being loved as a separate human soul. The child is being used, often unconsciously, as an extension of the mother's identity. That is where the damage begins. A mother like Claire does not simply look at a child and ask, "Who are you becoming?" More often, at the deepest level, she asks a different question: "What do you say about me?" That question changes everything. It changes the meaning of success. It changes the meaning of affection. It changes the emotional climate of the home. Because once the child becomes a reflection of the mother's image, the child is no longer free to be fully real. The child becomes symbolic. A performance. A mirror. A source of pride when shining, and a source of injury when not. Years later, many children raised in that kind of environment can describe the feeling, even if they cannot explain it. They often say some version of the same thing: "I never felt fully seen for who I was. I felt watched, evaluated, directed, shaped, praised when I reflected something good back, but strangely alone when I needed unconditional love." That is the emotional world a narcissistic mother creates. If Claire were to become a mother, she would not necessarily appear cold in the obvious way people expect. In fact, that is part of what makes this dynamic so difficult to name. She might look highly involved, highly invested, highly proud. She might know exactly how to curate the image of motherhood in a way that draws admiration. The right photos, the right school, the right activities, the right stories about sacrifice and devotion. She may seem deeply committed to giving her child every opportunity. And on some level, she may believe that commitment is love in its purest form. But the deeper truth is more painful. Opportunity is not the same as attunement. Investment is not the same as empathy. A child does not only need provision. A child needs to be emotionally recognized as a person separate from the parent's ego. That is the part Claire would struggle with most. Because empathy asks a parent to tolerate difference. It asks a mother to witness a child's emotions without making them about herself. It asks her to let the child have an identity she did not design. It asks her to handle disappointment without shaming. It asks her to offer comfort without turning it into control. For someone whose inner world depends heavily on admiration, status, and reflected worth, that kind of parenting can feel deeply threatening. The child's independence is no longer beautiful. It becomes destabilizing. A narcissistic mother often loves best when the child is easy to claim. If the child is talented, attractive, compliant, accomplished, admired, or unusually gifted, Claire may feel intensely attached. Not always because she delights in the child's humanity, but because the child reinforces her self-image. This is how the golden child is often created. One child becomes the emotional crown, the one who best carries the mother's reflected greatness. That child is praised, displayed, invested in, and treated as special. But even that apparent closeness comes with a hidden cost. The love is tied to function. The child is cherished not simply for existing, but for performing an identity that protects the mother's ego. That child grows up under a different kind of pressure. The world may see them as favored, but inside, they are often terrified of falling. They learn that love arrives most strongly when they excel. They sense, even without words, that failure would not just disappoint their mother. It would wound her. And because children are wired to preserve connection, they begin shaping themselves around that pressure. They become highly accomplished, highly responsible, highly polished, and deeply disconnected from the softer, less performative parts of who they are. They may look successful later in life while privately carrying unbearable anxiety. Because when your parent loves your reflection more than your reality, success never feels safe. It feels necessary. Then there is the other child, the one who does not fit the role as neatly. The one who is quieter, more emotional, less impressive to outsiders, more defiant, more ordinary, or simply less useful to the image the mother wants to maintain. That child often receives a very different version of the home. Less warmth. Less delight. Less patience. More criticism. More comparison. More emotional neglect disguised as discipline or disappointment. The mother may not openly reject the child, and that is what makes it so confusing. The child is fed, clothed, spoken to, perhaps even praised in public. But underneath it all is a cold truth the child feels in their nervous system: I am not the child who makes her shine. That feeling marks a person for years. A child who grows up emotionally outside the mother's preferred image often develops an aching sense of inadequacy. They may not understand why they feel less wanted. They may keep trying harder, becoming more agreeable, more talented, more useful, hoping something in the mother will soften. They run emotionally toward the very person who keeps leaving them hungry. That hunger can shape adulthood in devastating ways. It can become people-pleasing. It can become perfectionism. It can become attraction to emotionally unavailable partners. It can become a lifelong confusion between love and performance. That is one of the cruelest parts of parenting through extension rather than empathy. The child keeps assuming the answer must be better performance. If I do more, maybe I will finally feel chosen. If I achieve more, maybe she will finally relax and love me in a way that feels safe. But there is no stable finish line, because the child was never being measured by a healthy standard in the first place. They were being measured by the emotional needs of a parent who could not fully separate love from reflected self-worth. And even moments of tenderness can deepen the confusion. A mother like Claire may have genuine flashes of warmth. She may cry at graduations. She may brag about the child's achievements with breathtaking passion. She may comfort the child after a public disappointment, especially if that comfort reinforces the image of her as a devoted mother. To outsiders, those moments look like proof that everything is fine. To the child, they become part of the emotional trap. Because the mother is not absent all the time. She is present in bursts, especially when the child is aligned with her emotional narrative. That inconsistency keeps hope alive. The child begins to chase it. They keep trying to get back to those moments of approval, not realizing that what they are reaching for is conditional love dressed in maternal language. Daniel, if you were close enough to witness Claire as a mother, would likely feel the contradiction in ways other people missed. He would see how quickly her pride could turn into irritation if the child's feelings disrupted her image. He would notice how a child's sadness might be tolerated only as long as it remained graceful, manageable, and not too demanding. He would see how deeply Claire needed the child's behavior to reflect well on her. A tantrum in private might not upset her because the child was hurting. It would upset her because it offended the order she needed. A school setback might not break her heart because the child felt discouraged. It would wound her because it touched her own sense of failure. Again and again, the child's inner world would be filtered through Claire's ego before it ever received care. That is not empathy. That is possession in an emotional disguise. And children know the difference long before they can articulate it. They know when their tears are inconvenient rather than welcome. They know when affection brightens in response to achievement and cools in response to need. They know when they are being shown off rather than known. They know when the home feels organized around one person's moods. They know when love feels fragile. Even if they defend the parent, even if they idealize the parent, even if they spend decades minimizing what happened, their body remembers the instability of it. This is why the legacy of a narcissistic mother can run so deep. It does not only shape childhood. It shapes identity. A child raised this way often enters adulthood with a fractured relationship to self. They may become high-achieving but emotionally starved. They may become endlessly self-questioning. They may struggle to know what they want because they were trained so early to focus on what would secure connection. They may feel guilty for having needs. They may feel ashamed when they fail. They may feel strangely empty even when they succeed, because success was never allowed to become joy. It was always tied to survival. And the deepest tragedy is that so many of these children still long for the mother. Not the actual pattern, but the fantasy of the mother they kept hoping was hidden underneath it. The fully loving mother. The emotionally safe mother. The mother who would see them one day, really see them, and say, "You do not have to perform for me anymore. You were always enough." But parenting through extension cannot offer that consistently, because it is not built around the child's humanity. It is built around the parent's reflection. That is why this trait matters so much. Because when a mother cannot separate her child from her ego, love becomes conditional, identity becomes fragile, and the child grows up learning to earn what should have been given freely from the start. Part 7, Competition Everywhere. Competition, in a woman like Claire, was never limited to obvious arenas. It did not wait for a formal contest, a scoreboard, or a declared rivalry. It moved quietly through ordinary life, entering places where most people were simply trying to connect, contribute, celebrate, or belong. That was part of what made it so hard to name. People around her often sensed the tension before they understood it. They would leave a dinner feeling slightly smaller, a conversation feeling strangely evaluated, a happy moment feeling as if it had been subtly rearranged until Claire stood at the center of it. Nothing dramatic had happened. No public scene. No open attack. And yet the emotional residue was unmistakable. Something that should have felt warm had become a contest. Daniel only fully understood this after he had already spent enough time with Claire to recognize the rhythm of her inner world. By then, he knew that she did not simply move through life asking, "What is happening here?" She seemed to move through life asking, "Where do I stand here? Who is above me? Who is below me? Who is receiving admiration? Who is slipping? Who can be used as a contrast? Who might become a threat if I do not correct the balance?" It was as if every social setting contained an invisible ladder only she could see, and she could not rest until she knew exactly where everyone stood on it. That is the exhausting core of competition in female narcissism. It is not just a desire to do well. It is not even a desire to win in the healthy sense of challenge, effort, or growth. It is a deeper and more emotionally loaded need to establish superiority. The point is not achievement by itself. The point is position. The point is to feel elevated, undeniable, untouchable, and protected from the shame of feeling ordinary. Claire carried that need into nearly everything. If she entered a room full of women, she was not simply meeting people. She was assessing energy, beauty, confidence, status, and influence. If she joined a conversation, she was not only participating. She was locating the social center and deciding whether it belonged to her. If someone told a story that drew laughter or admiration, Claire seemed to register it not just as a pleasant moment but as a shift in emotional power. Daniel could almost feel the calculation behind her eyes. Not always consciously, not always in a cold and deliberate way, but instinctively. Who was rising? Who was being warmed by the room? Who was becoming more visible than she was? Once he saw it, he could not unsee it. At first, Daniel had mistaken Claire's intensity for discernment. He thought she simply had strong opinions and high standards. But competition has a different emotional scent when you stay close enough to it. It carries urgency. It carries resentment. It carries the subtle violence of a person who cannot allow another person's light to exist without negotiating what it means for her own. Claire did not seem able to witness another woman thriving without feeling some inner pressure to reduce, reframe, outdo, or reclaim the emotional focus. And the most painful part was how often she disguised that competition as connection. She could sound supportive while positioning herself above someone. She could offer advice that looked generous but quietly established superiority. She could encourage another woman's ambition while making sure that the final emotional note belonged to her experience, her standard, her greater refinement. To casual observers, Claire often looked socially skilled, even kind. Daniel knew better by then. He had watched too many moments lose their innocence the second someone else began to shine. One evening in Chicago, they attended a charity planning event hosted in a beautifully restored cultural space near the river. It was the kind of room Claire loved, polished but meaningful, elegant without being gaudy, full of people who cared deeply about being perceived as thoughtful, accomplished, and socially relevant. The event was meant to celebrate collaboration. Daniel remembered that word clearly because it ended up feeling almost ironic by the end of the night. A woman there, warm and composed, spoke briefly about a new community project she had been helping build. She was not flashy. She did not dominate the room. She simply spoke with clarity and conviction, and something about her steadiness drew people in. Daniel noticed several conversations turned toward her afterward. The admiration felt genuine, not forced. People trusted her. They wanted to hear more. Claire noticed it too. He saw the shift immediately, the same slight stillness that often came over her when another person's presence threatened to become the emotional center. She smiled, approached the woman, complimented the project, asked a few intelligent questions, and for a moment Daniel hoped he had misread her. But then came the turn. Subtle, elegant, almost impossible to challenge without looking overly sensitive. Claire began telling a story about a larger initiative she had once been connected to, one that sounded more polished, more connected, more impressive. She did not directly dismiss the other woman's work. She simply expanded the scale of the conversation until the original moment felt smaller by comparison. People who had been admiring the woman's authenticity were now drawn into Claire's version of significance. That was how she competed. Not always by attacking the person in front of her, but by altering the emotional frame until she again appeared to occupy the highest ground. Daniel realized then that Claire did not need formal rivals. She could create them out of anyone. A colleague with potential. A friend with natural warmth. A woman with a stable marriage. A mother whose children adored her. A stranger whose beauty seemed effortless. Anyone who possessed a quality Claire could not fully dominate became vulnerable to this silent transformation. They stopped being people in her mind and became points of comparison. That is what makes competition everywhere so corrosive. It does not leave relationships intact. It consumes them from the inside because it changes the meaning of ordinary human interaction. Friendship is no longer friendship if one person needs to feel higher. Support is no longer support if it is only offered in ways that preserve hierarchy. Community is no longer community if every success must be emotionally negotiated through envy, control, or subtle one-upmanship. And perhaps nowhere is this more disorienting than in relationships between women. There is a particular tenderness many women hope to find with one another: safety, recognition, the ease of being with someone who does not turn every strength into a threat. But a woman like Claire cannot reliably offer that. She may appear to, especially at first. She may know the language of sisterhood, empowerment, and support. She may know how to play the role of the woman who uplifts others. Yet beneath that performance, there is often a far colder current. She may celebrate another woman only as long as that woman remains beneath her. The moment admiration begins flowing too freely toward someone else, the air changes. Now support becomes critique. Praise becomes qualification. Closeness becomes tension. The room becomes a field. Daniel felt the emotional cost of that even though he was not the direct target most of the time. He watched women around Claire become more self-conscious in her presence. Some became eager to impress her, not realizing how much power they were handing over. Some instinctively pulled back, sensing danger without being able to explain it. Some tried to stay close to her because proximity to confidence can feel intoxicating, especially when that confidence is well-styled and socially rewarded. But eventually many of them encountered the same quiet bruise, the realization that being near Claire often required some form of shrinking. Competition also shaped the way Claire responded to correction. This was one of the clearest windows into the trait because it revealed how little room she had for mutuality. A healthy person can feel embarrassed, defensive, or uncomfortable when corrected, but they can still remain in relationship with the moment. They can recover. They can admit, reconsider, even laugh at themselves sometimes. Claire could not do that easily. For her, being wrong did not remain a simple mistake. It became an injury to position. If she had been challenged, exposed, or even mildly contradicted in front of others, the emotional impact went far beyond the actual content of the moment. What she seemed to feel was not merely, "I made an error." It was, "My rank has been threatened." And once rank feels threatened, a narcissistic competitor does not respond with humility. She responds with restoration. Sometimes that restoration came as a sharp intellectual pivot, a way of reframing the conversation so that she still appeared more perceptive than everyone else. Sometimes it came later, in private, through coldness or a cutting remark directed at the person who had challenged her. Sometimes it came through withdrawal, as if she were too elevated to remain in a space where her superiority had not been adequately protected. Daniel learned that even tiny moments could trigger this. A disagreement at dinner. A fact she got wrong in front of friends. A joke that landed more strongly for someone else. None of these moments stayed small because Claire did not experience them as small. She experienced them as cracks in the image. This is why life around a woman like Claire can begin to feel strangely narrow. Not because there are explicit rules, but because everyone slowly learns the invisible ones. Do not outshine her too easily. Do not correct her too directly. Do not receive too much admiration without expecting some consequence. Do not assume the room belongs equally to everyone. Over time, people adapt to these conditions without always understanding what they are adapting to. They become careful, strategic, less spontaneous. The emotional environment grows less human and more political. And that is the deep sadness at the heart of this trait. Competition, in its healthiest form, can sharpen us, inspire us, and push us toward excellence. But Claire's version of competition did not create growth. It created isolation. Because when everything becomes a contest, nothing can be fully shared. Not beauty. Not success. Not joy. Not vulnerability. Not even love. Every human exchange must first pass through the question of power. Daniel eventually understood that Claire's constant competition was not proof of strength. It was proof of fear. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of being eclipsed. Fear that if she were not the most compelling woman in the room, she might become emotionally invisible to herself. That fear drove her to seize territory everywhere she could, socially, romantically, professionally, aesthetically, even morally. She did not only want to be admired. She wanted to be unchallenged. But no one can build peace that way. Because a life organized around superiority can never truly relax. It must keep scanning, keep comparing, keep recalculating, keep defending. There is no rest in it. Only momentary victories and the constant dread of losing ground. That is why the people around someone like Claire often feel tired long before they understand why. They are not just participating in a relationship. They are living inside someone else's invisible tournament. And in a tournament, there are no real equals. Only winners, losers, and people waiting to discover which one they are allowed to be. By the time someone understands a relationship with a person like Claire, the deepest damage is often not what happened on the surface. It is what happened quietly inside. It is the slow erosion of self-trust. It is the exhaustion of always trying to read the room before speaking. It is the private ache of loving someone who could be so dazzling in one moment and so emotionally punishing in the next. It is the confusion of knowing that what hurt you was real, while also knowing that the person who hurt you was not cruel in the obvious, cartoonish way people expect. That is why these dynamics are so hard to explain and even harder to recover from. The pain is not always dramatic enough to sound clear when spoken out loud, but it is deep enough to reshape the way a person sees themselves, love, and even reality. That is what Daniel had to face. Not just Claire as she was, but Claire as he had believed her to be. The woman he first saw in Chicago had seemed almost impossible to forget. She had presence, polish, emotional force. She could make a room feel brighter simply by deciding to inhabit it fully. She could make attention feel intimate, desire feel meaningful, admiration feel like destiny. In the beginning, Daniel thought he had encountered someone unusually alive, unusually self-possessed, unusually compelling. And in some ways, he had. But what he did not understand at first was that being compelling is not the same as being safe. Being magnetic is not the same as being loving. Being deeply desired by someone is not the same as being deeply known. That is one of the most important truths to remember when thinking about narcissistic traits in women. The danger is not always obvious because the harm does not always arrive looking like harm. It can arrive as beauty, as confidence, as intensity, as charisma, as seduction, as ambition, as the kind of social intelligence that makes other people lower their guard. It can arrive wrapped in grace and emotional sophistication. That is precisely why so many people stay too long inside these relationships. They do not realize they are being diminished because the connection once felt so elevated. They keep reaching for the beginning, hoping the warmth they experienced at first was the truest part, while ignoring the pattern that has now become impossible to deny. And that pattern is what matters most. Not one sharp comment. Not one selfish moment. Not one episode of jealousy, vanity, coldness, or manipulation taken in isolation. Human beings are flawed. Everyone has insecure moments. Everyone can become defensive, image-conscious, or emotionally messy under pressure. The issue is not imperfection. The issue is repetition. It is the repeated structure in which empathy weakens whenever self-image is threatened. The repeated structure in which admiration is expected but rarely returned with equal sincerity. The repeated structure in which closeness becomes conditional, loyalty becomes something to be extracted, and another person's emotions matter only as long as they support her sense of self. Over time, it is the pattern that tells the truth, even when the individual moments remain easy to excuse. That is why this conversation matters. Not to encourage people to label every difficult woman a narcissist. Not to turn pain into cruelty. Not to flatten a complex psychological issue into a weapon. And certainly not to treat narcissistic personality disorder as a casual insult. Real diagnosis belongs to trained mental health professionals, and it should stay there. But people do need language for patterns that leave them confused, emotionally depleted, and unable to understand why someone who seemed so radiant could also be so destabilizing. Awareness is not the same as accusation. Awareness is how people begin to step out of fog. Daniel's real awakening did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened when he stopped focusing only on Claire's explanations and started noticing his own condition in her presence. He noticed how often he felt tense before social events. How quickly he edited himself when she was displeased. How deeply he depended on small moments of warmth from her. How often he left interactions feeling slightly wrong, even when he could not point to a single sentence that justified the weight in his chest. That is often how people begin to see the truth in relationships like this. Not through a perfect argument, but through the accumulation of internal evidence. Your body knows. Your spirit knows. Your confidence starts narrowing. Your mind becomes preoccupied. Your emotional life becomes organized around someone else's moods, needs, status, and reactions. Slowly, without meaning to, you stop living from your own center. That is one of the clearest warnings a person should remember. If a relationship repeatedly makes you abandon your own emotional reality, something is wrong. A person like Claire can pull others into a world where everything revolves around interpretation. You begin asking, what does she mean? Why did her tone change? Was she hurt, offended, disappointed, embarrassed? Should I have said less? Done more? Noticed sooner? Reassured better? And the more time you spend inside that system, the more natural it begins to feel. Hypervigilance starts masquerading as love. Self-erasure starts masquerading as patience. Emotional labor starts masquerading as devotion. But love that requires you to disappear in order to maintain it is not love in its healthiest form. It is adaptation to instability. Another truth worth holding on to is this: not every trait that looks glamorous is healthy, and not every trait that looks strong is rooted in strength. That may be one of the most seductive illusions in dynamics like these. A woman like Claire can seem powerful because she affects people so deeply. She can seem confident because she rarely reveals uncertainty in a vulnerable way. She can seem elevated because she knows how to manage image, status, and social energy with extraordinary skill. But internal health is measured less by how impressive someone appears and more by what their presence does to other people over time. Do people feel freer around them, or smaller? Do they feel seen, or managed? Do they feel encouraged to become more fully themselves, or subtly trained to orbit someone else's identity? Those questions often reveal far more than appearance ever could. That is also why many people who leave relationships like this feel ashamed of how long they stayed. They think they should have known sooner. They think the signs were obvious. They blame themselves for missing what was happening. But the truth is more compassionate than that. The reason it takes time to see these patterns is because they are not built only on pain. They are built on contrast. Warmth and coldness. Admiration and criticism. Closeness and withdrawal. Being chosen and being diminished. That contrast creates hope, and hope can keep people tethered to emotional harm far longer than logic alone would predict. They are not stupid. They are attached. They are trying to make sense of a bond that kept alternating between nourishment and deprivation. So if there is one thing a reader or listener should remember, it is this: confusion is often part of the injury. If the relationship leaves you constantly second-guessing what is real, that does not mean nothing happened. It often means the dynamic itself was distorting your ability to trust your own experience. There is also something important to remember about the woman at the center of this pattern. A person like Claire is not simply a villain in a shallow story. Beneath the charm, control, superiority, and emotional demands, there is often profound fragility. That does not excuse the damage. It does not erase the harm done to partners, children, friends, or anyone else drawn into her orbit. But it does add human depth. Narcissistic patterns are not born from joy. They are often built around shame, insecurity, emptiness, fear of being ordinary, fear of being exposed, fear of being emotionally powerless. What looks like superiority is often a defense system. What looks like coldness may sometimes be terror in a more polished form. And while that can help us understand the behavior, understanding should never become permission to remain where harm is ongoing. Compassion and boundaries must be allowed to coexist. That may be one of the most mature lessons in this entire conversation. You do not have to hate Claire to tell the truth about Claire. You do not have to mock her, demonize her, or strip away her humanity in order to recognize that being close to her may cost too much. In fact, some of the strongest people are the ones who can hold both realities at once. She may be deeply wounded, and she may still be wounding others. She may be suffering, and you may still need to step back. She may have reasons for becoming who she became, and those reasons still do not make your pain unreal. Daniel's healing did not begin when he figured Claire out completely. It began when he stopped needing complete certainty in order to trust what the relationship was doing to him. He did not need to diagnose her. He did not need her confession. He did not need a final dramatic revelation. He needed honesty. He needed to admit that whatever the label, he was being changed by the relationship in ways that made him feel less alive, less steady, less like himself. That is often where healing begins for many people too. Not in having every answer, but in honoring what the pattern has cost. And from there, something important becomes possible. A person can begin to rebuild. They can learn the difference between intensity and intimacy. They can relearn what stable affection feels like. They can stop confusing admiration with love and emotional pursuit with connection. They can begin to understand that real closeness does not demand constant self-abandonment. It does not require them to perform for scraps of warmth. It does not leave them feeling perpetually measured. Healthy love may still be imperfect, but it does not hollow out the people inside it. So what should the reader remember after everything? Remember the pattern more than the performance. Remember your inner condition more than the image someone projects. Remember that not every elegant woman is narcissistic, and not every difficult relationship fits this pattern. But when entitlement, lack of empathy, manipulation, conditional affection, and emotional harm begin forming a repeated structure, take that seriously. Remember that your pain does not need to be dramatic to be valid. Remember that charm is not character. Remember that being chosen by someone impressive is not the same as being cherished in a healthy way. And most of all, remember that losing yourself in the presence of another person is never the price true love should ask you to pay. This reflection is meant for education, awareness, and personal insight only. It is not a clinical diagnosis and should not replace professional mental health care, therapy, or evaluation. But sometimes a single clear insight can become the beginning of a much larger freedom. Sometimes naming what hurt you is the first act of returning to yourself. And once that return begins, even slowly, it can change the rest of your life. In the end, Claire's story is not just about beauty, charm, status, or control. It is about what happens when a person builds her identity on being admired rather than being emotionally grounded. From the outside, Claire seemed unforgettable. In Chicago, she moved through life with elegance, intensity, and a kind of magnetic presence that made people stop and notice. Daniel was drawn in by that light. At first, he believed he had found a woman who was confident, sophisticated, and deeply alive. But as time passed, he began to see the hidden cost of loving someone whose self-worth depended on comparison, attention, and emotional power. Claire's appearance became a weapon, her seduction became strategy, her confidence fed on putting others beneath her relationship with money served image more than stability, and her love was never truly steady because she was always vulnerable to the next source of validation. Even motherhood, in this pattern, risked becoming less about empathy and more about reflection. And in every space she entered, competition quietly replaced connection. Daniel's greatest pain was not only that Claire hurt him. It was that he slowly lost himself while trying to become enough for someone who could never be satisfied from the outside. That is what makes this story so powerful. It shows how narcissistic patterns do not always destroy through obvious cruelty. Sometimes they erode through emotional confusion, inconsistency, and the silent demand that everyone else protect one person's fragile ego. The deeper lesson is this: never confuse intensity with love, charm with character, or admiration with emotional safety. In real life, this means paying attention not just to how someone makes you feel at the beginning, but to who you become around them over time. Do you feel calmer, freer, and more yourself, or more anxious, careful, and unsure? That question can protect your peace. Disclaimer: this video is for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace professional diagnosis, therapy, or treatment from a licensed mental health professional. Here's a quick question for you. A. Do you think Daniel stayed too long because he loved Claire? B. Do you think Daniel stayed too long because he was addicted to the hope of who Claire seemed to be? Comment A or B below. And what is your opinion on this story? Have you ever seen a relationship where charm and emotional harm existed side by side? Share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can learn from different perspectives. If you enjoy this kind of deep, emotionally honest content, subscribe to the channel to support us and keep more meaningful videos coming.